Well, joining me now from Ottawa is Phil Gurksi. He's a former senior strategic analyst at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the author of The Threat from Within, Recognizing Al-Qaeda-Inspired Radicalization and Terrorism in the West. Also with us from Toronto is Amarnath Amarasingam. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and an expert on foreign fighters. Gentlemen, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Amarnath, let me begin with you. Before we talk about what Canada wants to do or what Canada is doing and what other countries are doing, let me ask you if we should be distinguishing between joining Daesh or ISIS as a crime in and of itself, and then also whether it can be proven that somebody committed crimes within their time with Daesh or ISIS. Is there a difference, and should governments be making that distinction?
Yeah, I think, making that distinction is important, I think, sociologically, but I think legally, the Canadian government has made that distinction to say it's not literally a crime to join an organization, but you actually have to be proven to have contributed in some way, either through material support, in order to be arrested for joining a terrorist organization. And so that's been the difficulty for a lot of cases that are coming back, of fighters who are coming back, because we don't know Syria, as much as it is a kind of the most mediated conflict in history, it's also a bit of a black hole where as soon as fighters cross in, we actually have very little idea of what they're doing once they're there, unless they're, as they used to be, kind of posting photos and videos of themselves quite often. But that distinction, I think, is important because unlike Al-Qaeda, for example, we've had a lot of women and children go over to join the Islamic State as well. And so making that distinction, I think, from a security perspective is probably important.
Right. So, Phil, it's very hard forensically, I guess, to prove that a crime was committed on the battlefield. And if somebody wants to go back home, perhaps even if they did do something, they're not going to admit to it, right? So with that in mind, is the bar too low to say that it's not exactly a crime if you just went over to Raqqa and you got cold feet and 6 months later you came back home, and you should be allowed to be reintegrated into Canadian society?
Well, it's a great question. I want to disagree with Amar to some extent, because it actually is an offense under Canadian law and has been since 1937, the Spanish Civil War, when Canadians went to fight for the nationalists. So it is an offense. The problem is can you prove it? And we've had a case of a Canadian who has come back and given a series of interviews for the New York Times in which he has admitted and then recanted having committed crimes for Daesh. The problem is, how do you prove it? So here in Canada, we make a distinction between intelligence, where I used to work, and evidence. And the two are not the same. They're not gathered to the same standard, and they can't be used in court in the same way. So I agree with Amar that one of the biggest issues is, what can you prove in a court of law? And the government does not want to proceed with cases in the courts that it's going to lose.
Yeah, Amarnath, what's behind the government wanting to reintegrate people into society? I mean, fundamentally, right? Do they want to use them as symbols of counter-radicalization to show that, well, you could have lost your way and gone astray, but you can fix yourself and come back and reintegrate into society, or not?
I think fundamentally it's about public safety, right? I mean, these are our guys who went over and were involved in terrorist activity, and you can't just leave them there because they're Canadian citizens, a lot of them. And so when they do come back, we treat them much like you would treat a gang member who was in prison and was released or something like that. We have to put into place some kind of post-prison reintegration program, whether it's giving them a mentor, helping to find them employment, or something like that. I think that's fundamentally important if the broader goal is reintegration and getting these guys to move on with their life in some way, that we treat them like any other prisoner. The difficulty now is a lot of these guys are coming back in Europe and elsewhere, and they're not going to prison. And so how do you convince an ISIS fighter who hasn't, unlike this Canadian, admitted to being in Syria, and I've interviewed several of these guys who told me that they were in Syria, but haven't been arrested and haven't actually faced any kind of legal issue. So if you walk up to them and say, I think you should go to counseling, or I think you should enter this de-radicalization program, they'll say, I'm kind of home free. Why would I ever admit to joining this group and then having to deal with all the legal consequences. So the difficulty becomes, as Phil was saying, there might be intelligence that they were there, but it hasn't really been taken to court in any meaningful way.
Okay, so Phil, from a security perspective, let's set aside what they call ISIS or Daesh brides and children and people who we can quite, I suppose, with beyond a reasonable doubt, we can say that they were tagging along or they were coaxed along, right? People who have, a semblance of innocence when they were taken along. Let's put them aside and park them off. Let's take people who clearly were ideologically indoctrinated, maybe received weapons training, explosives training, you name it, and for whatever reason, whether it was because the caliphate was losing or because they got cold feet or whatever, they come back to Canada, but you can't prove that they committed a crime. What on earth do you do with people like that?
Well, it's a great question. And if you look at work that Thomas Heghammer, the Norwegian scholar, has done historically with foreign fighters, he says that approximately 1 in 9, or about 10%, come back from foreign conflicts to plan acts in their home countries. So, we're talking about 180 Canadians, more or less, that have gone to a variety of conflicts. 60 or so have returned home. So, 6 or so are reasonably assumed to maybe start planning something. The problem is that you can't tell which ones in advance. They don't come back and necessarily parade their ideologies. So you have to investigate them all, in theory. And that takes a lot of resources. It takes hundreds, if not, many hundreds of people to investigate people. So if you have a whole bunch of people on the street, you have to devote resources to them to determine which ones are the problem, which ones are not. And I agree with Amar. If guys sort of came back, they weren't detected, they didn't do jail time in Iraq and Syria, they're not being charged here in Canada, why would they participate in a program? So, I want to stress the threat to public safety is real. It's not made up. It's not existential. And we're not sure to the extent these people pose a threat, but they do pose a threat. And at a minimum, they can use the ideology they still cling to convince other people to do analogous things. So the threat, I think, is multivarious, and we have to treat it as a real threat.
Yeah, and Amarnath, on the flip side, we have a country like Iraq, which of course almost lost its entire nation state to this group, who prosecuted about 100 foreign fighters, and some of them are up for the death penalty, right? So what does that tell us about the kind of discrepancy here, where you have Western countries thinking of reintegrating these people and Iraq sort of at the front lines of Daesh and the major victim of Daesh, giving some of these people the death penalty, these foreign citizens?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one because I think Iraq's approach has been pretty, has violated a lot of human rights law, I think, in very serious ways. I mean, they've put a lot of these people who've come out of the war zone on 10-minute trials and have faced almost certain execution. The difficulty is they haven't really done the due diligence to say who's a fighter and who's not, who's just kind of living in ISIS-controlled territory and is now also fleeing. And because they've kind of rounded up everyone who's in this area, they haven't done enough kind of careful vetting to know who's who. I think they just want to show that they're doing something, show their citizens that they're doing something, hardcore to these fighters, that they're dealing with this threat in a meaningful way. I just came back from a conference where I talked to a few Iraqi military people, and they were pretty much like, these guys are not human, right? I think his exact quote was, I think the West makes a mistake assuming that these guys deserve human rights, and that's based on the fact that they should be treated as human. And so I was kind of, the response is very different. And I think in the West, we do kind of, because they're Canadian citizens or American citizens, we do have a kind of higher standard to put these guys through some kind of process. The process is not risk-free, and so we might, of course, have some issue down the line. I think the broader problem, of course, is that a lot of these guys aren't, some of them may plot attacks locally, but I think the broader issue is they fit in this kind of middle area that I call disengaged but not disillusioned. So in other words, they're still very much pro-jihad. So if you ask them, a lot of these returnees, 5 years from now, there's another conflict, where would you be? And they'll say, I'll be on the next plane out. And so they've, for whatever reason, become disillusioned with this particular conflict, but they're not immune from being still kind of very pro-jihad. They will definitely inspire others, help people with logistics, help people with knowledge on how to cross borders and stuff like that. So there are other kind of threats that they could pose aside from simply plotting an attack.
Yeah, that's interesting. Phil, do you agree with that? That even if Daesh is destroyed, the ideology is still there, the impetus is still there, the motive is still there. There could be another group that crops up, and given the opportunity, a lot of these guys might swim into that.
Absolutely. Amar is right, and I agree with him 100%. In fact, my most recent book, The Lesser Jihads, that came out last year, discusses that very probability. There are dozens of conflicts around the world that embrace the jihadi ideology, from Nigeria to the Philippines, and some of these guys might find themselves there. And historically, we saw it. Some of the Afghan veterans went to Bosnia. Some of the Bosnian veterans went to Chechnya in the mid-90s. So it has happened historically. The whole thing with, and you know, Amar talks about, you know, the Iraqis treat these guys as subhuman. I don't agree with that either. But the fact remains is that, as you mentioned in your comments, Iraq is the country that faced the greatest threat and the greatest damage from this group. And Daesh was a heinous violator of human rights. So these people are subject to Iraqi law. We may not agree with Iraqi law. In fact, we may disagree with it, but the fact remains they committed the crimes on Iraqi soil. As for rehabilitation and you know, when Amar talks about disengagement, de-radicalization, I'm all in favor of rehabilitation if it works. Well, I'm a healthy skeptic, given my background in security and intelligence, that we can show that it does work. I'm sure it does, but I'm not sure where the data is, and I'm not sure whether the threat is, you know, it's mitigated sort of for a little bit of time, and then as Amar said, 5 years down the road, people re-engage, and that's the problem with disengagement. If you haven't abandoned the ideology, if it's still in the recesses of your brain somewhere, and you disengage, but you haven't de-radicalized, you can re-engage at some point. And we've seen that historically. I worked on cases in Canada of people that fought in conflict A, came home, and then left for conflict B. So it is going to happen, absolutely.
Yeah. Amarnath, let me ask you then, because you mentioned something interesting about it's seen as, well, these are our guys, right? We can't dehumanize them, perhaps, as some of the Iraqis have done. And I've had Iraqi politicians on this very show using language that dehumanizes anybody associated with Daesh, saying, you know, we kill them, they're Daesh. And, you know, I kept on asking, well, where's the proof first? You know, how about, you know, trying them in court and so forth? So I've heard that as well. But when you have Canadians and others saying, well, these are our people, they have the citizenship, therefore they should be afforded all the respect and the rights of that citizenship, I guess a workaround has been for Canada to cancel the passports, for the UK and Australia, I think, to cancel citizenship overall. The Belgians and others try different things. Does that work at all? That perhaps if we took away the citizenship, then we don't have to fully protect you under our law?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a bit of a cop-out. I think what we've done, Canadians have done with some cases and the UK has done with some cases, is for dual nationals, if you have dual citizenship, if you're a Pakistani citizen as well as a UK citizen, even though you were kind of raised in the UK for a long time, the UK has canceled your citizenship. So now you're the Pakistani's problem, right? The reason I say it's our problem and it's our guys is because these guys grew up in the West, a lot of them. They were radicalized here. They were radicalized within networks that exist in the West, and I think it's a bit of I think it's a bit unethical to export these guys and then say that they're somebody else's problem, right? I think that we've noticed, we've seen from a lot of these Western fighters. I mean, the Canadians, the 3 Canadians that I can name, you know, Salman Ashrafi, who killed 40 in a suicide bomb in Iraq, Tamim Chowdhury, who masterminded the Bangladeshi bakery attack, which hacked to death 23 people, and several other fighters who've killed foreigners. And I think that's our problem. I think we shouldn't really allow you know, the country to export these individuals and then wash our hands of them. I think I don't know if there's something unethical about that. I think these are our guys. We let them leave, or we. I don't know. I don't want to put too much blame on ourselves either, but I think that we should kind of deal with the problem because they left from here.
Right. So Phil, do you agree with that? That it's our problem beyond the citizenship issue. It's our problem if somebody was radicalized in Molenbeek or radicalized in Toronto or radicalized in the banlieue of France. These countries need to look inward and figure out what the hell is going on in these societies that's creating these people.
I do agree. I understand the argument for canceling dual citizenship. I think, as Amar said, it is a bit of a cop-out, but it does appeal to people's emotions. How dare you do this as a Canadian? You're not going by Canadian values. We don't want you anymore, so screw you. You can go back to your Pakistani heritage. But Amar is completely on base here. When I worked at the security service, all the cases, virtually without exception, of Canadians who either planned acts of terrorism here in Canada or left to join groups like Daesh or Al-Shabaab or whatever group abroad, radicalized in this country. So the genesis of the problem is indeed in Toronto, it's in Ottawa, it's in Vancouver, it's in Edmonton. We do have people who have access to radicalizers. They have access to online jihadi propaganda. They have access to like-minded friends and family, people that they go to school with, people that they attend mosque with, and they are radicalizing in circles here in this country. So even if you were to cancel their citizenship and say, hey, it's somebody else's problem, that does nothing to get around the problem of what do you do about radicalization here in Canada or in France or in the United Kingdom. So that's a much bigger issue. From a security intelligence perspective, all you can do is identify and investigate. And in cases where you have enough evidence to lay charges, you do. From a greater society perspective, you have to talk about, can we get into counter-radicalization strategies? What about early intervention? If you identify somebody early enough in the process, can you divert them off the pathway before it gets to the point where you start laying charges? And again, even though I'm an old security guy, I do support these programs in theory. What I want to see is the evidence that, in fact, they work. And most importantly, do these programs have any kind of effectiveness measurement mechanisms that say, here's what we did, here's what worked, here's what didn't work, here's how we have to alter it. So the bottom line is that radicalization is happening here in Canada, it's happening in the United Kingdom, it's happening in France, Belgium, Turkey, it's happening everywhere. And I think that governments and civil society actors have a duty to address this issue in a variety of ways, both to prevent attacks from happening, but also to prevent people from radicalizing to violence.
And Amarnath Amarasingam, as we look at countries trying to grapple with radicalization and deal with the conundrum of returning foreign fighters, particularly from Syria and Iraq and some other places as well. And we've mentioned a whole bunch of different countries, right? It's almost as if nobody's clean here when it comes to generating foreign fighters, no matter how egalitarian and wonderful your society is. In terms of dealing with the foreign fighter issue and counter-radicalization, is there anywhere right now on this planet that's doing it right?
That's a hard question. I think there have been instances of programs that have quote unquote worked, and I think Phil is right in that that the evidence is sometimes lacking. But I also would say I think our standards of evidence in this field are sometimes higher than in other fields. I mean, we still have gang prevention programs, even though youth continue to join gangs. We still have fire departments, even though there are still fires. But I think with terrorism, sometimes we say, if one guy from this particular program decides to recommit a violent act or join a terrorist group, then that means the entire program is flawed, and we should throw out the whole thing and start something new. I think that's a bit, I think that's a bit silly and misguided. But I do think, the Aarhus program in Denmark, which tried to put into place a mentorship program.